Welcome back, everybody. This is episode 15 of the Late Stage Podcast, and I'm your host, Sinan Schwarting. Having an espresso at midnight here in New York City. Spring is just about sprung here, on a little hint of good news for anyone who that's relevant for. Anyway, it's, perhaps the world, as spring arrives, will become more pleasant. Yeah, right. That never happens, right? Every week I say that I hope the news will be better next week, and every week it gets worse somehow. So this week, of course, we're here to talk war. The reason I drink coffee at midnight these days is because there's so much bad news, so much terrible news even, that you want to get that update late night. You want to get that news that, like, Kiev is still standing, right? And it's hard to sleep knowing all the things going on in the world. It's not just in Ukraine. With that said, I think on the left, I've noticed a general kind of need to do this whole whataboutism, this whole what Russia's doing isn't so bad, but look at what they're doing, and look what's happened in the past with these other people, or look what, and look what's happening in Syria, and as a podcast that has made a point of focusing on exactly those things, that's tried to make a point of emphasizing kind of foreign policy from the left's perspective and what we think is sort of important news and what merits being discussed regularly, right? I've discussed Yemen quite a few times, and I'm going to talk about Somalia later on in this very podcast. But I don't think we should feel bad about feeling bad for the people of Ukraine. And I think there are enough people on the left who are pro-democracy, even to the extent that we are skeptical of those folks who want to spread democracy right to Iraq and the like, because we know that our democracy is imperfect. We want to make that better, right? So we're very pro-democracy and critical of even some of the failings on the part of our own democracy. Now, I'll talk about this later on. I actually got a great interview for this episode. A returnee vis-a-vis Jakub Krawczynski from Poland. I had him on today because, of course, Poland is neighboring Ukraine. And so they're very much dealing with the kind of refugee crisis, as well as a number of neighboring nations around Ukraine. But Poland has a special history with Ukraine, a shared history of having been satellite states for the Soviet Union back in the day, right? And so they both came out of the Soviet Union feeling victimized, colonized. So they share this foreboding sense and fear of the Soviet, returning, the age of the Soviet Empire coming back, and them losing their sovereignty, their, the right to self-determination. So I think it's very important for us on the left to be able to sympathize with the people of Ukraine and to be okay with the fact that, Russian imperialism, or Soviet imperialism as it was once called, isn't better than U.S. imperialism, right? Just because it's different, right? People on the left have historically allied or sympathized with the Soviets in that conflict because the U.S. was perhaps in many ways the more belligerent imperialistic entity, the more lacking regards for human rights and people's sort of right to self-determination and all that. So I think we have to be able to apply that same lens when someone else is doing the same thing and subjugating people in the same manner. And certainly, right now, people in Ukraine are victims. They're being bombed, innocents are dying, human rights violations abound with vacuum bombs and hyperbaric. All kinds of terrible things coming out of there. On the positive side, there was a vote to censure Russia in the UN today. 141 nations voted to censure, which is unprecedented. I think even after Aleppo, which was a terrible thing in Syria, only like 120 nations did that. And then quite a few nations voted not to censure, to support Russia because of the sense that this wasn't so grave, and to keep geopolitical alignments intact. Apologies for that sip of coffee there. But so for 141 nations to condemn Russia in this way was fairly unprecedented. And not only that, but 35 nations abstained from voting, but among them this time were China, Cuba, right? Nations where their silence in this regard spoke volumes, right? They're typically going to back Russia sort of irregardless of what they're being accused of to keep this bloc intact, right? And so in this case, for them to say, you know what, we're not going to support you, we're not going to vote against you, right? We're not going to come out that firmly against, but we can't really say what you've done here or what you're doing here is okay, right? And it's important to note, China is a pretty serious trade partner of Ukraine as well. But Ukraine is a serious economy in Europe. They provide not just oil and gas, which is, I think, the main threat for Russia as far as a geopolitical rival that would break their monopoly on selling oil and gas to Europe, especially, in Crimea, offshore, there's natural gas deposits that, supposedly are a serious driver for Russia claiming Crimea, and for them maybe feeling like they have to attack now because Ukraine can cut off or has cut off Crimea's access to potable water, right? So, and it's not a very, I think the land is sort of disintegrating, it's turning into a swamp. So without the help of the mainland of Ukraine, Crimea will disintegrate, and I think in turn folks' access to that offshore natural gas. So it's pressing, for Russia to claim these resources to prevent Ukraine from getting them so that they can maintain that monopoly on oil sales. It might be existentially pressing, which again, that's not an excuse for Russia. In fact, I think it should be viewed as an indictment against Putin for not transitioning his state away from petrochemicals and gas and oil into an economy that would continue to sustain the livelihoods of Russian people and improve their lives. But at the end of the day, the fact that Ukraine wants to join NATO and not be a part of any sort of former Soviet or modern day Russian bloc is an indictment against the ability of Putin to actually make life something to write home about in Russia, right? Why would you want to join a bloc with a nation that has such a low standard of living and an economy that's not especially powerful beyond its, having access to key resources that are necessary for energy in this day and age? Again, perhaps that's a whole other conversation, but again, it's very noteworthy that so many countries voted to censure Russia for this aggression against Ukraine, and for those who even chose to abstain rather than to vocally support Russia in this case. There were 5 nations that supported Russia, Russia being one. Belarus, who's in fact now sort of materially supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. North Korea, right, which I don't think anyone feels like that's a valuable partner to have in this day and age. Syria also, right, Assad's Syria is not exactly the ally that you'd write home about at the moment. And then Eritrea, they've been waging a war against Ethiopia for some time, perhaps feeling like they need to gain permission to do what they want to do. They need to support someone else doing it, right, as far as aggression and militarism goes. So not exactly like the Avengers of superpower nations out there, but a team of 5 nonetheless, I guess. Now, on the other side, right, the entire world has voted to sanction and get in the way of Russia's aggression here. And I mentioned in our last episode how even Japan has ratcheted up sanctions. Of note now, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, they're going to build a new pipeline between Russia and Europe that's been cut off, canceled. It's a thing of the past. In fact, some of the companies involved are declaring themselves insolvent. It's over. And for Russia, they're calling that like an egregious, right? We're never coming back from this with Germany again. And for Germans, it's like, we're being strong, and they've offered material aid militarily to the people of Ukraine. So they're breaking age-old traditions here now in coming out in support of Ukraine, right, or coming out against this sort of autocratic reach of this petro state that's attacking Ukraine. So you'd think, oh, okay, so Germany's coming out strong here. There's another story at the same time, and it's not necessarily a criticism of Germany, right? The government is doing all these things I've said, but on the corporate side, which is always a side to contend with, right? I mentioned Nord Stream 2 being cut off. Well, Nord Stream 1, which has been active since 2011, and majority holder, I think, is E.ON, which is a German company, Europe's largest operator of energy networks. They've been working with Gazprom, right, which is the Russian sort of firm in charge on that end of things. And they've been pumping oil into Europe from Russia, again, since 2011. And they're not cutting that off. And they've dismissed any possibility of that. So, I mean, that is an irony here, that while this war is waged and while all these sanctions are put out there and this sort of act of defiance is, we're coming out against this sort of imperialistic aggression, whatever, there is still money being exchanged. There's still oil being pumped into Europe from Russia. So in a sense, there's a facade. There's some bluster here. And the corporate end is always, as usual, playing a role in making some folks look a bit hypocritical, perhaps. But so, yeah, without further ado now, I don't want to hijack too much of this conversation about the war in Ukraine. I'm going to introduce now my friend Jakub Krawczynski from Poland again. And yeah, he'll introduce himself a bit further. He's been here before to talk about Belarus. Yeah, without further ado, Jakub. So with me today, again, a returnee, my first returning guest, which, the honor is yours. And of course, if only it was to talk about like some breakthrough, green technology coming out of Poland or, something to cheer everybody up. Of course, yeah, that's not the scenario we're in. Jakub Krawczynski. I'm screwing it up again, right? Yeah. You tell us how.
But you're doing.
I did okay.
I mean, you're doing. Yes, you did. You did a lot better actually than I anticipated. So yeah, making progress here. Yeah. So yeah. By the way, funny you mentioned the pronunciation, because now I feel like with the whole situation going on, I feel like taking up some Ukrainian, just out of solidarity. Yeah. So
there we go. There we go. And so yeah, I mean, I guess just to give listeners a bit of context before I basically hand the mic over to you.
Yeah.
And I'm going to feed you some little questions, But first of all, I've invited Jakub on, not only as sort of an expert, as we've already previously discussed, in geopolitical affairs, or at least someone with a similar interest as I have, but also as someone who's geographically very relevant right now. Jakub is in Poland, in Lublin, Poland, and I'll let him give us a little bit of context on that first. But yeah, as such, and for folks who are, to cater to the ignorant stereotype of folks in the United States, for anyone who doesn't know their geography so well, Poland neighbors Ukraine. But so let me quickly then, with that said, hand the mic back to you, Jakub. Where are you specifically, right? Like in relation to Ukraine? And how do we situate that for our listeners?
Yeah, right. So, like you mentioned, I live in Lublin, which is the biggest easternmost city. Pretty close to Ukraine, because I live like 150 miles away from the Ukrainian border. And so Ukraine is one of our neighbors, like from the eastern side, like Belarus is the other one from that side. So and this distance and the fact that here the European Union begins, and from this side NATO also, begins. Of course, Estonia is also a member, but it makes it, like the first day the whole Russian aggression broke, everybody was taken by a little bit of surprise, at least. And everybody was scared. I know I was scared. I mean, I even at what point at one point I thought to myself, like, if they're gonna go further with with shelling of the cities, like if it gets out of control, my city would be the first, probably the first big city to be shelled, bombed, in some ways. So yeah, it's the threat is very real, although I came to slightly alter my perspective now, and I think more realistically, because we got a better understanding of what's going on. But the whole thing is very very personal to me, also because I happen to be working in a company, I work in a German company that also happens to have offices in both Kiev and Kharkiv, the two biggest Ukrainian cities, because Ukraine is a very big IT hub. Because now I work for an IT company, and there's lots of talent here. I got to know some of those people, very talented, very there's some kind of Slavic immediate understanding between
Camaraderie.
Us and yeah, camaraderie, exactly. And I grew fond of those people. Even a day before the war broke, I was talking to my colleagues, some work related stuff. They were very helpful, super helpful, the best professionals I've ever met. And then the next day, I see on the Zoom or whatever that they're offline. I'm super scared that if anything happened to them, of course.
Those images from Kharkiv are terrifying, right? I can only imagine how you received
yeah
them.
Yeah, so I took it very personally, and also I took it even more personally because my daughter happens to be going to to school, and one of her friends there is also from Ukraine. And that mother of that boy happens to have a family and they were fleeing from Ukraine, and we impromptu we decided we will help them, and we asked if the her family needs anything, some supplies, whatever, and we bought some mattresses, blankets, it was very spontaneous, but super we did super fast, 7-8 people, we bought that stuff, brought together, and I delivered it to her. And as I was I went to her house, because we live pretty close, almost 500 meters away from each other. And as I was delivering that to her, and I almost broke into tears, and we hugged each other, and yeah.
I can't even imagine. And so quickly, to give first of all some slight geographical historical relevance, Poland and Ukraine are historically linked, right? In fact, you guys hosted a football tournament together not long ago for
right.
For soccer, football fans. That will be something people will remember as connecting the two nations. And for some geographic context for anyone in the United States, I'm here in New York City, right? The 190 kilometers that Jakub was talking about is the distance from here to Montauk, right on Long Island, which
Right.
is sort of it's the end essentially of the island, but Long Island is considered the outskirts of New York City, right? So for anyone who's trying to sort of place where he would be relative to where this war is going on, we're talking about on the context of United States geography, it's within state, it's within very places that you go to for the weekend, for example. here.
Yeah.
So I can't even imagine, I mean, to say that you're neighboring the war, even though perhaps you're not, because you probably know people in Poland who are literally along the border somehow, or have family or extended family, or whoever it might be that has some connection to that beyond obviously your actual connections to Ukraine itself. So I can't even imagine, But so real quickly then, I think let's sort of drive it home here and go into the history too, because I think if you're Polish, you're not just watching your neighbor get attacked by Russia, right? You're also, I think, probably viscerally like what the Ukrainians are fighting against, and you get the sense now that we're seeing it kind of live and on TV every day, we're getting all the footage that they're fighting for their lives. There's a sense that like going back to when they were controlled by the Soviets is like going back to prison, right? That's what it feels like what they're fighting against to some extent. And of course, that's not true. I think to some extent Russia could never win because of the extent to which Ukrainians clearly are not going back, right? But I think for you in Poland, you have a very similar history. Am I wrong? Like, do you not feel to some extent that you could be next? Or, sorry, let me hand you the mic.
Pretty good point that you made here. Like, because the whole thing, the way I understand it is like what is Putin driven by is like this grand desire to reunite all the former Soviet republics or satellite states, but it's not just like a reenactment of a Soviet Union. I think he even thinks like to resurrect the the great Russian Empire, and if he would have Ukraine, then probably he would think of like grabbing those other Baltic states like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and then probably we would be the next on the menu, and then he would probably go after Moldova, and there would be just like so this would be the historical context, because as after Yalta conference, after the War II ended, everybody knew, on the Allied side that it is what it is. I mean, Churchill knew that they're gonna handle, Poland to essentially to Russia, and we were under basically de facto like a satellite, of a Soviet Republic for 44, almost 45 years. And it debilitated us like greatly. I mean, the entire elites, our elites were exterminated. Like there were so many puppet governments, during that time, so we know this all too well, what can happen, and how in some ways irreversible or very difficult, even after so many decades, the damage like it does, the Soviet, the Russian, or now Russian, but in some ways I like to think of of them as again as acting like Soviets did, so it's a perspective that's very close to us. Like this seems like it's forever haunting us, because this trauma is not so easy to heal to any, like countries like Romania or Hungary. They had been very traumatized by being under, the Soviet oppression for so long, and and this also is connected with, that. Some of us, I mean, not many of us that are still alive, that lived during that time, but we, from the history, we kind of remember how, basically the Great Britain screwed up with their Neville Chamberlain as their prime minister of that time, that he underestimated, Germany, and everybody was so late to to help, and we were kind of getting the same vibes initially, and we were kind of scared that the West is not going to do anything, and for some time, like a day or two, it kind of seemed like that, especially that everybody like it like exposed like how many things in the world, in the Western Europe, are dependent from Russian money, Russian relations, Russian transactions on so many levels. But I'm glad that almost everybody like cut off ties, and and they did the right thing. So in a way, Putin did something that seemed impossible, like to completely unite the entire Europe. So this is this is one thing that's heartwarming in a way.
Exactly. Well, and in the same way that you're saying that what Russia is doing to Ukraine and is trying to do at large is sort of irreversible. A lot of what they're doing to their reputation abroad and what's happening now is somewhat irreversible too. And insofar as because this is now becoming a normalized process and step for folks in Europe and the United States and elsewhere to step in. And it's really in my last episode, I talked about how even Japan was sanctioning Russia, right? Like Japan does free business with China, eternal rivals, geopolitical enemies. But even Japan said, no, we're not messing with these petrodollars, these Russian petrobucks anymore. But so I mean, it's a fascinating thing that's happening, and the response, it's been galvanizing, I think, to some extent. Now, I guess real quickly though, I don't want to skip my line of questioning here. Where were we? So we talked a little bit about the background. What precipitated Russia doing this in that regard? Is it the sense that Ukraine was becoming too galvanized as this sort of part of Europe, and this was almost like a last-ditch effort? As far as I'm aware, Ukraine didn't do anything drastic very recently to signal that they were joining NATO or the EU tomorrow or anything to that extent. And of course, these things have been going on. A promise had been made long ago. So I guess that's where all of that line of questioning and reason is going. What has Russia acting this way now? In your mind, I guess I should say, right? We're not politicians necessarily or even experts.
Yeah. Well, all right. So basically, I think Putin has become completely unhinged, and like I said, this great reconstruction of the great Russian Empire is probably what's driving him, because I can see, I can find any political excuse from what Ukraine had been doing. Of course, it's very important to note that 2014, the annexation of Crimea, which is very historically important to Russia. I mean, Churchill even made an anecdote in after the war that Russians don't care, or Soviets don't care about, that the people are dying, but they would care greatly if something like Crimea was destroyed. So there's some insane amount of attachment to some kind of historical symbols or whatever, and I think this is more than anything else that's on than any economic or strictly political reason. And of course, it's important to note that some areas like Donetsk, I think the area is called Donbass, I think, and some other areas.
Donbass is that's Luhansk and Donetsk combined, right?
Luhansk,
I don't know if that's a natural region, if they've just combined two and given it a name, or I mean, it's also worth mentioning that Russia has this history of creating these little autonomous zones, and I don't know how fictional they are,
exactly.
Or historic, right? I don't know what Transnistria or Nagorno-Karabakh, where these areas from which they can sow chaos in multiple different countries, right? Like
Yeah.
they have a history.
I think they were just really smart. I think they were just really smart after the war to have those areas like this so that they can sow further chaos and confusion. Even our Kaliningrad, region, which is bordering with Poland, like like a little bit of Russia, but it's there between Poland and Lithuania. Yeah, so there's many of those regions like this. Yeah.
So I mean, if they had, if they needed
like
to
I
cook up
mentioned-
some false pretense for attacking Poland, it might be Kaliningrad, for example, right? Like they is that essentially what you're identifying?
Well, not in
Not
this
to give them any
specifically,
ideas,
but yeah, yeah, especially not to give them any ideas. But no, I think basically what I was just trying to say, that Russia, has many those little regions through which they they can manipulate, they can go further from their as far as spreading their influence, and yeah, and that's what it is. So to reiterate what the answer, the main part of the answer to your question, it's purely like a combination of two things, like Putin becoming completely unhinged, probably running low on time, but for what reasons, I don't know. Maybe he anticipated the response. Of course, he must have, even in his insane. I mean, the world has been kind of overrating his abilities, but I think he, of course, anticipated heavy sanctions, and probably he earmarked or put aside some kind of a war chest, to mitigate at least the initial response, and probably it's calculated to last for this long, and and he probably had a goal of claiming, because essentially what he wanted, I don't know if this is a common knowledge in the US, but his tactics was to quickly capture those essential crucial cities like Kiev and Kharkiv, and quickly install his own puppet government, to quickly end this, and
sort of lock
to create
down
essentially
Ukraine,
something
right? For his
Yeah.
purposes politically.
That's right.
Yeah.
And obviously it's not going according to his plan, and and we got to be thankful for that mighty Ukrainian army is doing very, very fine, all things considered, the proportions of the armies.
Yeah, no, and if I could add anything from my knowledge, I think the one caveat to Crimea is offshore they have some natural gas or something, right? That would again further end their monopoly on being able to sell petrochemicals and the like, right, to Europe. And so fundamentally, what's I think not spoken about, and especially for those who want to apologize for Putin or who want to kind of both sides things or whatever it is, what people are failing to recognize is that Putin is essentially running an oil state. He has an oil regime in place. They're squeezing every bit of money they can out of their pretty much primary export, or their few primary exports, right? I think it's oil, natural gas.
That's right. There's only
aluminum.
3: oil, gas, and arms. And
right.
Those.
And that's the thing. And he's funneled his resources into developing a strong military to project some sense of military might, world power, strength, relevance. And it's this kind of machismo idea of what he wants to project to the world, rather than improving the lives of Russian people, sort of transitioning away from those resources that are depleting, right? The whole world's aware of the fact that these fossil fuels we're running out of them, and there's no way that they can replenish. So fundamentally, instead of transitioning his nation and his nation's economy and the well-being of the people of his nation towards whatever the future may bring, it seems like he's really just holding on to the only mechanism he can think of to sort of remain relevant politically or geopolitically or whatever it is. And it's kind of, it's a waning world power, in my sense, that can't come to terms with or accept the fact that they are. And anyway, sorry, if you have anything to add to that, please go ahead.
Yeah, of course. One other thing, as far as building Russia to be some kind of and presenting itself and flexing as some kind of a military powerhouse, of course, you could make a case for that. But in reality, if you look closer, I mean, some of the aspects of Russian army, they make it seem like it's strong, but I would say it's a colossus on clay feet, because when you look at their navy, supposedly it's the second most powerful navy, but they only have one carrier, and they can barely keep it functioning, because it's so hard for them to maintain it, and the US has like 11 aircraft carriers and 9 helicopter carriers, so it's like like there's no contest. And some of the situations we saw, I think, already during the war made this army look extremely bad, like some Romani, like some gypsy people, like they stole one of their tanks,
I saw that.
Or like ordinary people were, just simply thwarting their efforts, like, so there's, I think it like the strength in numbers. This is the like their main. This is essentially what they have going on for mainly.
Yeah, and a strong will for sure. Sorry. So let's keep things moving. I feel like we've gone way over already, right? As far as but everything's so fascinating. I don't think I can cut anything. So anyway, I guess we'll skip Belarus. I mean, it's actually interesting that our very first meeting. Your first appearance on my podcast, we discussed Belarus, in fact, and they're back in the news, backing Russia. But I guess we've kind of already addressed. I mean, they're just one of those nations that's still in thrall of Russia, and although they have their independence, this is kind of what he's trying to create in Ukraine. We'll leave that at that. This is, I think, going to be the more interesting part of the conversation that we still have left. I'm curious. So. Being on the left in the United States, I understand the ethos, the logic of a lot of what they're doing. But on the other hand, like the left here is notoriously, at least panned as not being very knowledgeable as far as like foreign affairs, foreign policy, as being particularly interested. Right, we have so many issues domestically that there's this sort of. Not necessarily isolationist. I think that's not the right language, honestly, but very inward, and self-critical, I think, also. But, trying to modify some of the things that the U.S. has done wrong positively regarding foreign policy, and a lot of the stuff that you're seeing Russia do now, we can be uniquely critical of, because we've been critical of the U.S. doing similar things, being too aggressive with neighbors and the like historically. But so, on the one hand, we have, I think, a fairly myopic view, but on the other hand, I'm trying to break out of that by doing this podcast, focusing on foreign countries, foreign affairs, foreign policy. And so I wanted to sort of throw this your way, So the left has historically been very critical of really the existence of NATO. Not historically, right? I think everyone understands the logic of the Cold War and all that, but I think after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia became what it is, a country that struggles for the most part economically, that has a very low standard of living, that, as we've discussed,
exactly,
fairly outwardly a waning superpower, right? Like, why do we need to give them some? Like, why aren't we poking a dog? Like a dog in a cage. Aren't we poking it with a stick here by doing this whole NATO thing? Right? That logic seemed to work for the longest time, and a lot of Putin's aggressions, Crimea, even right, but Transnistria and South Ossetia and Karabakh, I think,
Yes.
I think it is Karabakh, right?
Yes, Karabakh.
But so these other regions, they kind of flew under the radar enough that we didn't really recognize the extent to what Putin was up to. I think we kind of, in some ways, underestimated him, in part because of how much that the kind of liberal media was overestimating and kind of over implicating Putin in some ways.
That's right.
Sorry, we have a lot of New York sounds. But so anyway, so between one side overestimating Putin and the other side completely underestimating him, what's happened, with the war in Ukraine, I think, is that suddenly there's this recognition that a lot of people had it wrong. And I think for the Maddows and the folks who were putting a lot of stuff on Russia, they feel probably very vindicated. And I think a lot of people on the left feel like, whoops, I guess, we've been saying NATO doesn't need to exist, but here's a guy clearly kind of proving the need for something along the lines of NATO. So,
exactly.
What do you think about that? Sorry, I spoke for a long time there.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. So first of all, like 2 years ago, when Trump was still president, we were the U.S. was on the verge of of leaving NATO. At least probably it would really come to that if Trump had stayed, for the second term.
Oh, yeah.
So that's a scary thought. And the threat of the West overestimating Putin is also an interesting one. And maybe I will combine it with another thing that I didn't touch upon yet, but the entire Western Europe got swayed by Russia, and by allowing Russian billionaires to have so much influence through things that so many common people are interested in, like by allowing them to become really powerful figures in the world of soccer, football, and also I know for a fact that
the Brooklyn Nets, Prokhorov bought the Brooklyn Nets for a while, and he kind of recently flushed his funds when things were getting kind of fuzzy between the two countries.
Yeah.
So even as far as the NBA.
And Russia also made the Western Europe or even Poland very much so reliant on their fossil fuels, and even to the extent that they kind of dissuaded Germany from using nuclear power plants and going back to coal. And this was a very calculated move because they used so much deception through Gazprom and other those oil giants. I know for a fact, but I forget, maybe it was in a different country, but they even enlisted some ex-CIA, executives to to sway other countries into succumbing to basically for fossil fuels from Russia. Even our country had been reliant, even if 80% of our energy needs we can get it from our own coal, but we still import it. We pay 15 million zlotys a day for for coal from Russia that we don't even use, but our government kind of had before, because there was some support behind the scenes, etc. And then the funny thing about it is they probably thought, our government, that that it's going to be subtle, and because of this camouflaged Russian support, they're going to rule forever. And now it came to violent realization that this is not the way to go, and they have to discard all of that. And I'm glad we didn't become another Hungary, like we hadn't become. That's the better choice of tense, because it would be harder. We all see how Hungary reacts. They like denied the transportation of any kind of weaponry through their borders. Essentially, what they only allow is like humanitarian efforts, and that's it. And then so that's important. I mean, I want to reiterate, like the whole West, like neoliberal left, neoliberal basically, not left in the slightest, like gets swayed by Russia, gets too much, became too reliant on Russian fossil fuels, like dissuaded from nuclear, even left, even the green parties, like those ecological driven motivated parties, like also get somehow manipulated into thinking like nuclear power plants are somehow bad for the environment or dangerous or whatever. And and that's
Exactly. No, it's fascinating for me that, like, the way that, like, if you watched the corporate media here, the way that they were projecting Russia onto like social media platforms and stuff was so pernicious. And for those of us who are like too online, I mean, we're all aware of how they're doing what they're doing. And I think if you're savvy enough to sort of know enough about history and know enough about like human behavior, you can almost identify trolls in troll farms and all that stuff very quickly, right?
That's true.
So it was like, it was just this split reality between like what they not quite understanding the technology were reporting versus what we were kind of seeing and experiencing, and how I mean, what they've managed to weaponize globally through propaganda and trolling and bot farms and all that is they've managed to weaponize people who are kind of dumb. They've managed to weaponize idiocy to the extent that they got people focused on things that were not particularly relevant in this context. And what's happening here with Ukraine is that everyone's kind of recognizing it, I think, and starting to recognize again that, wow, there is a force at play here. As much as we want to sort of joke about democracy, it isn't happening. And the United States has huge, that's not a joke. The United States has huge issues with democracy and lobbying, legalized corruption, and industries, gun industry, and all these terrible things that are happening in our government, and foreign lobbies, and the Saudis and whatever it is. But fundamentally,
the Chinese,
right, the Chinese, no doubt, but Israel, I mean, India, right? There are so many very powerful, influential lobbies in our government that are actively, openly doing that, and it's a sort of bad function of modern democracy, but that doesn't by any means diminish the positive functions of democracy. And so what's happening in Ukraine is, I think we're starting to see in broader terms, despite the minor criticisms we have here and there, right, that we're sort of hashing out on the political battlefield, there is a larger threat, right? And it's interesting that Putin is so wholeheartedly manifesting that. I mean, I guess, do you have any thoughts to close on? Any parting thoughts? Sorry, that's perfect. Take us out on a heartwarming thought. That's good.
I mean, the whole war, I mean, brought us, the Polish people, who were more polarized than ever, united in help. I mean, we still probably deep down hate some, like Democrats and the GOP hate each other guts, etc. But as far as the efforts, the real actual help goes, like it's a wonderful unison, of people helping, doing, people doing frantic shopping, so that they can deliver those extra supplies at the border, like it's so that divisions even between politicians, like, have now, for this moment, for this particular time frame, have become irrelevant. Of course, we do not forget what they are, but it's really heartwarming that for some brief moment, and let's enjoy this moment. I hope in some way that this conflict is going to end, this aggression is going to end, and this constant help won't be needed anymore, because everything will not go back to normal, but will kind of wane. But
and well,
yeah. It's really, yeah.
I mean, I guess that our final thought should just be thoughts are with the people of Ukraine and their struggles, and that that they're really on the frontier of a battle it's not fair to put on them at all, but they are certainly fighting it valiantly.
Yeah, exactly. And just one last thing, when Zelensky was appointed the president of Ukraine a couple of years ago, I wasn't the biggest fan of him, but now I just can't help but feel like this guy is for me is the biggest hero, the biggest historical figure, bigger than anyone else after 1945 combined, basically. Even if some of those deeds or messaging is kind of exaggerated but I know this is a kind of propaganda in a good faith, and it's very important. And Ukraine is winning this war also on this front, and let's hope they're gonna keep doing that. And
for anyone who's on the fence about should I really I know everyone has this apprehension about the United States, right? And it's imperial history, but you really do have a guy, and if anyone doubts if he's doing the right thing, I mean, he's been given the opportunity to be airlifted out. He's choosing to basically maybe die with his people, and his people are clearly fighting with everything they have. So I don't think anyone can really doubt his intentions. He's even said this isn't about nationalism, it's about something much larger. It's about the peoples of the world coming together to fight against autocracy. No one on the left, and especially on the left in the United States, because we haven't had to operate with this for a long time. And so most people on the left here are pro-democracy, whether they even recognize it or not, and so
that's right.
You shouldn't feel bad to be on the right side here. You shouldn't feel bad saying that this is the right side, because I think it very clearly is. But anyway, thank you so much, Jakub, for being here, and for giving us all the local info. And it's great to have you, as always.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, very nice. Thank you so much, Jakub. Always great to have guests. Always great to have local expertise, right? Folks from the regions we're talking about who can give us, a fuller story here. No doubt the support is strong for Ukraine. I didn't want to press him on a few things, but I wasn't going to nitpick and argue semantics while he's talking about a situation that's very close to home for him, and I think very pressing and existentially frightening, right? At the end, this is going to be perhaps my segue to the next story. He didn't say that the story of racism at the border was fake news per se, but he did seem to sort of suggest it had been blown out of proportion, or maybe there was not a lot of truth behind it. Well, no, that's not the right paraphrasing. No, he definitely acknowledged the reality of it, but I think we can all acknowledge that in a wartime scenario, with the rhetoric being used, I think a lot of people wanting to protect the future of Ukraine, letting the women and children through, and so the guards at the border, right? They're probably there's gonna be some, if not racism, internal bias and the like at work. Lots of chaos, people with different priorities at the time. So I think these stories are very real, and in fact, we have students from Africa, especially, and the nations of Nigeria, Ghana, Zambia, Namibia, Morocco, Outside of Africa, you have students from India, Pakistan, China, a number of students who have struggled to get past the border. In this case, I don't know if it was Polish guards, but in fact, Ukrainian ones, supposedly giving them a hard time, trying to give priority to Ukrainian women and children. But so, no doubt, like rhetoric and emotions are ratcheted up in those scenarios. So priorities are different. The Ukrainian government has come out and sort of said that's not right. We've got to let everyone out. This Russian aggression shouldn't put anyone at risk. Da, da, da. So, I think it's important we recognize that this is a real problem. That there, even with emotions ratcheting up and all that, racism is never okay, and it's a shame that that's happening. With that said, it shouldn't detract from the main story, and it shouldn't distract from it either too much. Racism is a problem in and of itself, and I think for folks where the threat, the existential threat, is autocracy coming across the borders, right, and like the Soviet Empire rekindling itself or whatever, right? They're not maybe racism against African students might not be on their radar, or against Indian or Pakistani or whoever students. But for those students and for people from those countries, like, racism is a more pressing issue for them, even an existential one. So nobody's right or wrong in prioritizing the story. With that said, I think we can just tell both stories and not really have to question the veracity or anything like that. With that said, certainly I think the real tragedy, because none of these people have died yet or anything as far as I'm aware of. With that said, they could, and it's important they do get out and that they're allowed to get out. Certainly the big tragedy right now are people dying in Ukraine, and I don't want to distract from that. So just a side note, so while we're on the subject of Africa, I'll do one final news story. In Somalia, the U.S. is up to its old tricks, and for anyone who wants to do any whataboutism or talk about, like, what about the West's sort of nasty habits of warmongering? So no doubt, this is legit. The United States has yet again unleashed drone strikes. In this case, it was in Somalia, outside of Mogadishu, in a town called Duduble or Duduble. Supposedly there were 0 civilian casualties. Knock on wood. Nobody can guarantee that, of course, and I think nobody can even necessarily guarantee that being reported means that it's true. I think typically those things get reported as such, and then the truth comes out. So, hopefully it is true. It's also worth noting that this is an operation carried out by the Somali government against the Al-Shabaab militant group, terrorist group linked with Al-Qaeda, and sort of rebels within Somalia trying to seize control from the government. It was an operation conducted by the Somali government, but I think you can't conduct these drone strikes without support materially from the United States, actual assistance. So similar to the scenario in Saudi Arabia, right, where we're helping that oil state, petro state, conduct a genocide against the people of Yemen, right? It's typically the Saudis who conduct these operations, but again, I think they need Americans on the other side helping them conduct the drone strikes. So we do help beyond just like providing people with weapons and money or whatever. We're actually a part of the war mechanisms in these places. So we're up to our old tricks again in Somalia in this case. Not that I side with Al-Shabaab, right? But drone strikes are notoriously prone to civilian casualties. They're notoriously inaccurate and can cause problems. So I'm not at all in support of that. And I think there is some truth to the fact that if we're going to report on what's happening in Ukraine, we have to also recognize tragedies elsewhere. And while there's nothing so tragic coming out of Somalia as far as the news yet, there's a possibility of that. And certainly it's sort of another story of US-assisted drone strikes. And the real tragedy there is what's happening in Yemen, which underscores, instead of doing my like Weird of the Week this week or a media rundown of what's happening in the US media, which I suppose you can all imagine what that is these days, I'm going to sort of briefly talk about, what's happening in Russia, what's happening in Yemen with the Saudis and the United States. How much better would the world be if we didn't need to rely on these folks for valuable resources like oil and natural gas to provide energy to our homes and whatnot. Folks on the left tend to have a fairly domestic view of politics, right? Especially here in the United States, where folks have Medicare for all and all kinds of issues, with police violence and democracy fraying, lobbying, corporate lobbying, and the like. There's so many issues that we tend to focus on the left that are fairly domestic, and we get called isolationist as such, as if we're not interested in helping the world beyond, or not interested in foreign policy, or our relationship with anyone else. And I think that's not fair. And in part, that's what I aim to do with this podcast, is show our perspective on global politics. And I know a lot of folks on the left tend to view, like the Soviets in the old days, as the underdog against the U.S. imperialist mechanism, which was more belligerent by all means, and disregarded human rights and people's right to self-determination and all that, far more perhaps than the Soviets did back in the day. Perhaps. I think there's a debate to be had, maybe. I'm not trying to have it. The point I'm trying to make simply is that in this case, we don't have to back an imperialism. We don't have to back a lesser evil. Hopefully, right, and one positive thing that we can probably talk about coming out of this war, Europe rising up and acting in the way that it has, perhaps more aggressively than the United States even, it provides hope, right, that perhaps in the future, as the US's power and significance wanes and China rises, so too might Europe. And instead of having a world where two giant superpowers are constantly warring and, on the right and the left, we're picking this side or that side in a sort of fairly black and white manner, we can take a more nuanced stance, right? We live in a world now where everyone is increasingly having the ability to speak for themselves, to vote for themselves, to have a body that speaks for them. The EU, right? We don't have to support NATO perhaps in the face of Putin if the EU is empowered to defend itself more to the extent that it maybe is currently via sanctions. However we decide, it's the best way to defend the continent, to defend democracy against autocracy or whatever it is, I don't feel like folk on the left should feel bad for feeling bad for the people of Ukraine, right? Human rights abuse is being done against them. We have to sympathize with folks in that situation, regardless of where we might, have given our support 40 years ago in some separate vacuum of geopolitics that doesn't exist today. The Soviets don't exist. The Russians are not socialist or communist by any stretch any longer. They're oil magnates and oligarchs and very capitalistic. As Jakub said, perhaps they're more akin to the old Russian Empire than the Soviet one, in fact, right? The czars and the czarinas, who still were expansive and trying to, colonize and the like. So, however it is you want to frame it, like, the Soviet doesn't exist. I don't think the Russians are the friends of the left any longer, right? They've been sowing chaos on the far right. It's worth noting that folks who are supporting Putin here are the likes of Nick Fuentes or Marjorie Taylor Greene or Boebert, folks who I could have given the weirdos of the week instead of doing this little diatribe. And I think that it's important, when we, and how we sort of myopically view the sort of things domestically, that we look at the big picture and we support green energy, right? We support alternative energy. We want to clean the environment. And that's perhaps the most pressing issue of our time. That said, you look at the way that autocracy is taking root in Russia, and Russia's becoming a petrostate, and instead of accepting its waning power, it's becoming aggressive and militaristic. You look at Saudi Arabia, similarly, right, who are essentially requiring the United States to help them genocide the people of Yemen, the Houthis. And again, we kind of have to, because we need their oil at a cheap price. And they're not even particularly friendly in that regard, but we're still kind of at their beck and call because we need oil. And so perhaps if we widen our scope and we take more, we take foreign policy and the like into account more, we can find that these things will actually fortify our worldview in better, more significant ways than we, than they were being fortified previously. And this is a perfect example. Not only would having green energy and the like help us save the environment and prevent climate change, but additionally, right? Like, imagine Europe wasn't paying Russia all this time, and they weren't then funneling the money into the military, which they're now using to bomb the Ukraine. Imagine we weren't funding Saudi Arabia and helping them genocide the people of Yemen. Right? There's various ways that we can imagine a better world if we didn't need certain folks' oil, if they didn't have the power they do over us by controlling that valuable resource. Think of the wars we might not have gone to. But so anyway, that's, I suppose, my parting thought. Follow us on Twitter at LateStageTrib. Follow us on Instagram, LateStageTribune, one word. Follow myself at Sir_writes_a lot. We'll be back next week. Obviously, as always, we hope we'll return with better news. Until then, peace out, especially peace in Ukraine. And your aggression, man. Forget it, Putin. You don't need to do this. You don't have to go out like this. Peace out, everyone. See you around.